All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to another presentation. In fact, the final presentation in our series on troubleshooting with FusionReactor. This will be part 4 on post-crash troubleshooting. And I'll be your host for the next 30 to 40, 50 minutes, hour or so. My name is Charlie Earhart, and I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself by my company, careheart.org. And I focus on server troubleshooting. So I'm not an employee of Integral, the company that makes FusionReactor, but I'm a longtime user, 10 years plus. Love working with the folks, love working with the tool, and love sharing it with folks. So happy to be doing that with you here today. And in this final session, we're going to do things kind of the same way we did the first 3 parts. After a little bit of an introduction, we're going to dive in. And the first thing I'm going to talk about, since this is about post-crash troubleshooting, is I'm going to show you the ways that FusionReactor's logs can be really valuable for solving problems. And some people love logs and some people hate logs. I think I have good news for both of you. And the bottom line is that they can be really valuable, and we'll talk about why shortly. One of the reasons why I think people who don't like logs might like them is that there's a new feature in FusionReactor 7.2 and above, so you may not see this, but I'll show it to you in this session, called Archive Metrics. And so if you're not on 7.2 and you don't see this when I demonstrate it, you're going to want to get there because it's a really valuable tool, and it makes working with those logs so much easier, and especially for post-crash troubleshooting. Now, the logs are helpful. There's a lot of things, it's an amazing amount of things that are logged, but there are some things where the level of detail is too great to be logged. But some great news is that there's a feature available in FusionReactor, which I would argue everybody should enable, called alerts. They're called crash protection alerts. I'm not going to focus so much on the crash protection part, but just on the alerts, because the alerts are really valuable for post-crash troubleshooting. So again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then moving on from the alerts that are built into FusionReactor and have always been there in the on-premise version of FusionReactor, some of you may know that there's now a cloud implementation of FusionReactor. It has nothing to do with you being in the cloud. It's that FusionReactor is in the cloud, as well as being implemented, as it always is, locally. And there's a way to have your data sent to the cloud for you and only you to see. And that cloud mechanism has its own alerting capability. So we'll wrap up talking about that and why that could be even more powerful for some people's needs. But even if you don't use that, these other things will apply to everybody. And then we'll wrap up with a recap of what we've covered in these sessions and where you can go from here. And as always, I try to end with resources for learning more. And we'll have time throughout for questions and answers, but I'll also open it up at the end for any. All right. So as I said, this is the last of a 4-part series. The first one, just to give people, because some of you may be coming here and not having seen the others, I just want to give you a perspective. The first one was what's just happened on my server. So using FusionReactor to know what's going on right now or just recently. And that's really valuable because if you can get on there and look at things, sometimes you're going to see what the problem is. And again, perhaps even in a level of detail that wouldn't be logged, but you'll see it in the live interface. So we went over several features for looking at that. Then we talked about why problems may be happening, and I'm realizing now I've got another page to follow there. I'll go into this a little bit more. So let me just say we talked about why requests or transactions were running slowly, and I'll talk about what those features were in just a moment. And then the last session, part 3, was on when the requests or processes are slow and you can't readily tell. What are the less obvious reasons? What are the features that FusionReactor gives you to be able to see what those less obvious reasons were? And I want to say all these are recorded. All these webinars are recorded. So you can go right now to the FusionReactor website, webinar site, just Google FusionReactor webinar, and you'll find these and about 15 other sessions that have been recorded over the past couple of years. As far as the audience here, we are presuming that in this session, you're at least familiar with FusionReactor, using it preferably. But if you're not, you might still get value out of it. The thing is that many people who have used it perhaps for years are sometimes overwhelmed by its richness, and they're not sure where to turn to solve problems, and they're not even aware that they've got these incredible capabilities. And so that's the point of this whole series. And these concepts that I'm about to describe, they apply pretty much to any server you might monitor with FusionReactor. In fact, I can't think of anything I'll say today that won't apply to any server that you might monitor with FusionReactor. And if you didn't know it, some of you are Cold Fusion people, some of you are Lucy people, but you may be also a Tomcat person, WebLogic, WebSphere, Jetty, Glassfish, doesn't matter. All those can be monitored with FusionReactor, and you can use these techniques and tools with any such application server. And again, this presentation is being recorded, so you can watch it later and revisit details. Before I move on, I just want to throw out there that FusionReactor 8 did come out in recent weeks. You want to check that out if you're still on FusionReactor 7. I am. I decided since I'd started this in FusionReactor 7, I should finish it in 7. Not that there would have been any big, not particularly different, you know, there's nothing I could think of that in this webinar would have been different had I been on 8, but I just didn't want to confuse matters by switching to 8 and having something show up that maybe people weren't familiar with. So future webinars will certainly be done on FusionReactor 8. All right. And so just quickly, I'd said that the first part was focusing on the aspects of understanding FusionReactor for current and recent processing. And I've highlighted how you definitely want to know how to use the web metrics, the request activity history, slow and longest and error history pages, and the resource tracking for CPU and memory and garbage collection. That was all covered in part 1. Part 2 went on to talk about looking at the JDBC and transaction pages and how you could see things like HTTP clients and CF HTTPs and whether those are within a request or across all apps and the history of those. All great stuff. If that's your problem, it'll jump right out. But then I showed in the last part a little more challenging problems can be often solved with either of these sort of features that FusionReactor adds: stack tracing, profiling, the thread CPU sampler, and the memory profiler. And those last 3, profiling, thread sampler, and memory profiler, are in the ultimate edition of FusionReactor. There are 3 editions, but everything else I've talked about would be in the standard edition, and everything I'll talk about today will be in the standard edition. Can't think of anything I'll say that won't be. So again, those are all great when you're looking at FusionReactor while things are happening or once it's restarted. But as some of you know, once you restart your application server, whether it's Lucy or Cold Fusion or some Java server, all these user interface elements that you've typically used to understand what's going on now or recently, those are wiped out. They're set to 0, as it were. And that's because your app server starts up. FusionReactor is in the app server, so the things that are in FusionReactor's memory, they're lost, just like sessions in your application would be lost. And that's the design of FusionReactor, and it certainly frustrates some people. But here again, the whole point of this session is to say, don't worry. I know that frustrates you, but don't think that FusionReactor is useless after a restart. That's what a lot of people think. It's not true. I know when you're looking at these elements, you think it's useless that you can't see before the restart. But the whole point of this session is to say, no. There's things you can look at after a restart, and that's what we're going to cover. Okay, so the things that you can look at, whether in the user interface or otherwise, after a crash. And sometimes they will help you to understand what was going on just before the crash, or perhaps leading up to it, maybe even in the seconds or minutes or hours or days in some people's cases. You can see the progress of something that led ultimately to running out at the end. Or it might have been something that happened in just the last few seconds and all of a sudden. We don't know, but the point is we'll look into what's available and figure that out. All right, so first up, I said, is the logs. FusionReactor's got many logs. Now, you know, there's conceivably nothing in the interface that would help you to see what there is to see with the logs. You know, if you look at this, it's like, this isn't logs, and you're right. But some of you know, first of all, that under the covers, FusionReactor is writing logs. These logs are stored in the FusionReactor folder, wherever you've got FusionReactor installed. I'm going to quickly, let me do this just a second. I didn't think to get a, no, just a second. I'm going to get a directory looking at my FusionReactor installation just to show you. This is just my local one, but it's okay. It helps you to see where the FusionReactor logs are stored. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble on my monitor. So I know you're not seeing anything yet. That's okay. We'll have it there in just a moment. Okay. So this is my FusionReactor directory, and it'll look just like yours, whatever drive it's installed, whether you're on Windows or Linux, doesn't matter. In the FusionReactor folder will be multiple folders, which you don't really need to pay attention to. What you want to pay attention to, pretty much always, the only thing you want to pay attention to is this instance folder. And within that instance folder is going to be whatever instances you're running. So whatever name of the instance you gave them when you implemented FusionReactor in that instance, that's the name that'll appear here. And usually be pretty straightforward. You'll recognize what it is. And you can see here I've got different things being monitored. But the point is, whichever one you're using, I'll just pick one randomly. In that folder, again, there's a lot of folders, but you really only need to pay attention to two. And one is called the log folder, and one is called the archive folder. Now, the log folder is where, if you've got an instance that's up and running right now, this is where the logs for the current instance would be being logged. Now, in my case, that's not my current time. So this is an instance that isn't currently running, but that's okay. The point is, if this instance were running, then this folder name would be the current hour. And in this hour would be, in this folder would be the logs that FusionReactor creates. And there are certainly many of them. Now, when you're looking at this live view of the current log, for every log you see, you'll see a lock file. Just ignore that for now. You won't need to worry about it. Sometimes they'll be there, sometimes they won't. Doesn't matter. All we really care about is the logs.log. And there's many logs, as you can see, several logs. Now, in this presentation, I really don't want to go into the logs and explain what they are, because, in fact, I'm going to show you in a moment that while the old school way was to dig through the logs, the new school way is to leverage the feature that's new in 7.2 called the archive viewer. But I'm just saying, if you're either not on 7.2 or later, or if you have a reason to want to dig into the logs directly, here's where they are. And if you open up any one of them, I'll just pick one randomly. Like we talked about garbage collection the other day, so there's a GC mark sweep log that tracks when and how often garbage collections are happening. So this is every 5 seconds by default, and this is how many major GCs or mark sweep GCs for my current GC algorithm, how many happened and how long did they take on average. Again, I'm not going to go any further than to say that, but the point is this log tracks that every 5 seconds. And so if you wanted to look historically prior to a crash, now I'm saying this is the current one, so this is not crashed yet. It's not the point. But the point is, if you wanted to look at this log to see what's going on currently in the last hour, this is where the current information would be. Now, I keep saying in the last hour and this hour. That's because by default in FusionReactor, at the end of every hour, these logs are zipped up at the end of every hour that the instance is up. FusionReactor will zip up this log folder, and it'll put it in the archives folder. So I told you there were two folders to pay attention to. The other folder is the archive folder. And that is going to have, by default, 31 days. Now, this is my local machine. I haven't had my instances up all the time. You will probably see 30 days of dates, and they're in descending order. If I've got sorted by date, these are the most recent. And there's my different dates. In my case, the dates I've had this particular FusionReactor and Cold Fusion instance running. Point is, you would probably see one for every day for the past 30 days. And let me just pick a random one. And then, assuming this instance has been up all day, you'd expect to see something for every hour in here. Now, again, I'm not running a server that's been up 24 hours, so this one starts at 5. But if we were looking at yesterday, yours might start at 11 p.m. I've sorted it by date, and you'd have 11 p.m., 10, 9, and 8, 7, 6. All right. So every hour, the log is zipped up, put into this archive folder, and there's a zip, and you can't really see this. Let me bring this out. There's a zip and a props. Again, ignore the props. We don't care about that at all. Look at the zip. There's a zip every hour. And if there's ever a zip that's not on the hour in a regular production environment, I would argue that this is an indication of when your instance has crashed, because I said there's zipped up every hour on the hour, but they're also zipped up at the start of an instance. So if I had a crash at 125 or sometime prior to 125, when at 125 my instance started up, it would create a zip of the 25 minutes from the top of the hour to 125. So this would actually represent what was going on right up to the crash, right? See how valuable that is? Now, again, I'm going to show you to leverage the archive viewer to look at this, but let's just say that you were looking at this and you were wondering what went on. you could just dive right into this zip. If you just double click it in most environments, you would be taken into the zip. You could extract it if you need to, certainly if you're on Linux command line. But the point is, in Windows, you could just double click it and almost always just go right in, and there they are. There's the logs, and you can just open them up, and there's my Mark Sweep log again. Not that I'm not focusing on that now, but the point is you can see how readily you can look at your logs. So that's looking at it in the file system. Remember, we said that there's a log folder and an archive folder. Now, in the interface, there's a couple of ways to look at the logs as well. First of all, if you're interested in looking at the previous hours and days of logs, let's say you don't have access to the file system, right? So if any of you turned away because you thought that's not going to help me, I can't get to the file system, listen up. This will help you. In FusionReactor's interface, down here in the bottom left, is logging log archive. Now again, we'll come back to the archive viewer in a moment, but the log archive, and if you're seeing that, please don't go there, listen to me, because there might be something interesting that you'll get out of this. We'll get back to the archive viewer in a moment. So in the log archive display, this is looking at that archive folder. It knows where the archive folder is, and there's a configurable setting there. If you put it someplace else, it would have probably been told. But if you change it, you could change this logging settings to point to where the archive is. But this just figures it out by default unless you change it. It went right to my archive folder for this instance. And just like in the web, the File Explorer, here are my folders, and they're presented in descending order. And this is my current running server, my real current production server. And there it is, my 8 to 9. I'm on Central Time, and this is showing the time to me as Central Time. So this was my 9 o'clock zip, the last hour between 8 and 9. And if I ever saw it showing a time, particularly here, it says 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. If it was a time representing a crash, then I would see that it was a different time. And I'm pretty sure that there would also be an indication here telling you that it was a time of a crash. I'm not going to dig around to try to find that, although I'll just say you can easily go back over time and look at previous days using this interface, clicking here. But the point is, once you've found, I don't know why it's not coming up immediately. Yeah, there you go. Once you've found the one you want to look at, here's the cool thing, is that if you're in your browser, even if you're looking at your server, you can see the zip, because when you click this link, it will download it in your browser to you locally. So it's okay if you don't have access to the server. It's okay if you can't get to the file system. This, as long as you can log into FusionReactor, you can get to the zip. And when I double click on it or single click on it, there you go. And it's open on another monitor, but there you go. There's my zip for that hour. Again, so I'm not going to dig any further than that, just to say, there you go. You can look at the previous hours to your heart's content. And there's more to see there, but I don't want to move on. I don't want to get bogged down in this. You get it, that you can look at the logs through the UI, through the file system. One last thing I'll just say, because some of this might interest people. Let's say you really wanted to look at the current hour, what's going on right now. Right now, well, this won't help because this is the previous hour. Well, to see what's going on right now in the logs, FusionReactor for a long time had FusionReactor logs. FusionReactor logs, yeah, check that out. And that takes you to an interface that looks at the top 128K by default, the most recent 128K of any log. Now, you can't tell with this interface, it's kind of old, and I hope someday it'll be improved, but you can't tell that there's other logs here. It's up here. So this drop down shows you, again, all the logs that are currently being tracked. And I could pick any one of those. Like I'll look at the Mark Sweep log. And now I'm looking at the current Mark Sweep log for, in my case, from 9 to whenever the bottom of this display is. So it goes to 9:20, the current time. Now, again, this is limited to the 128K most recent of the log. So sometimes you'll look at this and it won't go back very far in time because it'll be cut off. And that's configurable in the logging display. For various features, you can configure how much stuff you want to see. But I wouldn't make this bigger. And again, this is an old way of looking at it. Generally, you'll want to use the archive viewer to look at logs anyway. But just so you know, you can do this. We've covered other sorts of configuration things like the logging size and the view size in like one of the third or fourth webinars we did on configuring FusionReactor for action. I'm going to leave you to look into that more, or just read the docs or reach out to support for help. All right, so that's it for the logs. I think we've seen enough for the logs. And again, some people hate logs, don't want to see it. But here's the good news. There is now archive metrics. So this is in 7.2 or above, archive metrics. Now, first of all, you may have noticed there was a button there. Sure, but how many of you are going to come to this page? But if you do, and you want to look at the viewer, you can go to it here. But more typically, I would think most people are going to find it when they look at metrics, right under web metrics. Ah, look at that, archive metrics. Or when I was looking at logging, we saw that it was down here as well. So however you like to look at logs, or if you don't even think to look at logs, they want to expose that there is this archive metrics, archive viewer. They're the same thing. So however I click on it, the point is I go to this thing called the archive viewer. And what's great about it is I'm now looking at the previous hour's logs. So you can see there again, I'm looking at 8 to 9 for today. Now, at first, you might think, this is just the metrics web metrics, right? Well, no, it is the same information that would have been on the metrics web metrics, in some ways a little bit different, but the point is it's the same kind of information that would have been there. If you didn't know it, pretty much everything that's on the FusionReactor metrics web metrics page gets stored in the resource log. And if we were to have looked at that, we would have seen that it had columns like CPU and heat use and number of requests running and number of queries running and average response time of request. All that stuff is tracked in the request log, in the resource log. So here we are in the log viewer, by default starts out looking at the resource log. Well, this is log, right? This is not your father's log. This is FusionReactor is graphing the previous hour's metrics. Now you may say, well, I could have looked at the previous hour's, metrics in FusionReactor. That doesn't impress me. Okay, well, let's look at last month. So yeah, this date picker, you can go back as far as your logs are kept, and by default, they're kept for 30 days. So I've just randomly picked a date. I'm looking at February 20th, and it looks either at the midnight or the 11 p.m., depending on certain circumstance. But the point is, I'm looking at my 1 a.m., midnight to 1 a.m. of, a couple weeks ago. And I'm pretty sure my instance has restarted since then. But the point is, it doesn't matter whether it has or hasn't. I can look at the logs. Yes, I'm looking at the logs of a couple weeks ago at a particular hour. And if I wanted to look at a particular time that day, and by the way, notice when I click that picker, if I knew I had a crash on that day and I want to find the log from that day, I would find the time when I know I had the crash. Or if I don't know when it was, remember, you could just look in here and find a time that's not on the hour. And again, I just randomly picked a day, so I don't have a crash that day. But let's say this had been 1325. Well, then this would be 1325 to 1400. I'd want to look at 1300 to 1325. So I'd look at the time prior to the different time, because that would be the previous hour, the previous half hour, whatever it was, prior to the crash. And I would just click on that. And now I'm looking at that set of logs for that hour. But the point is, it would graph them, right? So if I'd had a crash, I might see, for instance, the CPU suddenly ramped up. The memory may be suddenly ramped up. The requests running could have gone up or down. And I'll leave you to explore these. These are not new information. It's the same stuff that's on the metrics web metrics. It's just presented in a different way, but it's the same sort of stuff you'd see on the metrics web metrics. It's exactly the same sort of stuff, but just presented in different ways. And the point is, whether you were focused on were query run times going up, were queries per second going up, were request times going up, whatever you wanted to focus on, you could focus on it. Now that's just the resource log, but I could also, for instance, look at the GC logs, like the Mark Sweep log. And now I'm looking at a graph of the GCs during that hour. And I'm just looking at the major GCs because I picked the Mark Sweep log. If I wanted to look at the minor GCs, I'd look at the scavenge log. And as we talked about in the second session, or the first session, minor GCs happen all the time. This is very typical for minor GCs. This is how many are happening. One happening every, 20, 30, about every 5 minutes, doesn't matter. And how long are they taking? 100 milliseconds, I don't care, that's nothing. But if I were having a GC problem, I'd suspect I'd either see major GCs happening frequently with long durations, maybe I'd see them suddenly clustering up right at the end. And the point is, listen, if you thought you had a GC problem, everybody thinks, oh, that's my problem, it's garbage collection, it's JVM, I got to tweak arguments. Well, wait. If you look in here, this is not lying. If it doesn't show a bunch of GCs happening right up to the time of your crash, no, you don't have a GC problem. Now, I will say sometimes the situation is that the instance can't even write to the logs. That can certainly happen. It can be so bogged down and it can't even write to the logs. So sometimes you will see that the time here doesn't coincide with when you know the instance went down. To that point, I want to say for all these logs, this is kind of interesting. Check this out. Graphs are nice, but sometimes you want to see the real data, right? Well, check this out. Up here at the top, there's View, Spreadsheet View. So again, I'm in the Archive Viewer, choosing View, Spreadsheet View. And that changes to showing me the logs like we saw in the file system, but check it out. There's tabular headings at the top. So I don't have to guess anymore. What was this column? What was that column? Now, some of them are really easy. We told you that the last two columns were how many GCs happened and how long did they take. But some of the logs have 20 or 30 columns, and it's hard to tell which one's which. These headers can be great for that. But anyway, in this case, here it is, and I could just scroll up and down and see. Check it out. I can also click on this and sort it. So I can see, during this hour, when did I have the most GCs in a given moment? So that's all doable. I can search it if that made sense. In this case, it doesn't. If I was looking at the request log, for instance, there is a request log we talked about. Well, I didn't mention that. There is a request log that tracks every request that runs. Let me go ahead and click on that. I'll come back to the other point I was going to make in a moment. But here I'm clicking on the request log. One of the FusionReactor's logs tracks by default the start and end of every request. And as I scroll across the right here, I can see the start and end. This is executing and completed of each request. Every request gets an ID. So these may be start and end in one after the other, but sometimes there'll be a gap where one starts and doesn't end for a long time. The point is you can connect the dots of when did it start and when did it end. And then as you continue to the right, you can see things like what thread it ran on, usually not important. What IP address it came from might be important. The request method, the URL that they requested. Now you may say, where's the query string? That doesn't appear here. The query string appears off to the right in another field. That's just a long time. It wasn't there when it was first designed, I guess, 10 years ago. But anyway, then there's how long did the request take? So if it completed, how long did it take? If it's just executing, then it's just started. It doesn't matter. So these zeros are probably starting. But this is when they complete, how long did they take? Anyway, my point is, let's say I wanted to search for calls to my blog. Now I'm only seeing calls to my blog that say blog. So I can do that. And of course, I can just use my browser and look for, better and find the occurrences of better, whatever you prefer to do. And again, this is all sortable. Yeah, look at that. I can sort it and say, well, show me in this hour of my blog requests, which have been the longest in that hour. Pretty cool, right? So that's just great stuff that you can do from the logs. It used to be, and I did a webinar on this last year, you could also export these logs. You saw them. We could just take them and pull them into Excel and do an analysis that way. But now you can do some lightweight analysis this way. And speaking of exporting them, besides viewing them in the spreadsheet view, we can also export them. So yeah, in this interface, I could say, I just want this log. Now, it's not filtered. Don't get the wrong idea. It has nothing to do with this filter that I did. If I said export, I'd be getting the whole, in this case, request log for that hour. That's what I'd be exporting, whatever log I'm currently looking at, in whatever hour I'm currently looking at it. Now, you may have noticed that when I looked at the view, there's also a text view. And then it just looks like I'm looking at the file system, just like before. It's just a dump of what was in the log. Now, one other thing I'll say about the archive viewer is that if I'm looking at the request log, this is one of those ones where, you might have 100,000 requests in an hour. You could easily, right? Well, it's not going to fill up your display here with 100,000 lines. By default, this viewer will limit it to 20,000 lines. If you open a log that has more than 20,000 lines, you'll get a prompt up here saying, hey, we've truncated this log so you can't see beyond 20,000 lines. And you'd see the first 20,000. And that's where you'd want to export if you wanted to see more. All right. Now, I was getting to a point in the, I forget. I was getting to a point in looking at one of the archive metrics views for, it was the resource log. Let's see if I can remember what I was going to say. Oh, that you might find that when you look at the end, you might say, does this really represent exactly what was going on at the end? Well, that's where if you were to go to the spreadsheet or text view, either one, I'm saying you might want to go to the bottom of the log, just use this slider and go to the very bottom, and check and see if the time down here is the time that you know the instance went down. Let's say you know it went down at 135. Well, if you came down here to the bottom of these logs and looked at 135 and there was nothing there since 130, then that would tell us that, well, even though you think you brought it down at 135, FusionReactor stopped writing log lines at 130. Sometimes the JVM can be so bogged down that it can't even write log lines, and that would be a clue. So 130 was really when the problems happened, and in fact, something prior to that, right? So the point is, now that you know that it really ended at 130, you'd want to again look at these various features to say, well, do you tell me anything about what was going on prior to that 130? So I don't want to bog down in that point. I'm just saying you need to dig into these logs, and there's all kinds of logs. I'm not going to go over them all in this presentation, but this is a tracking of the use of memory in the old gen, which is part of the heap. And you might see sometimes that went up, or you could compare that to the Eden space or the meta space or the compressed class space. And I see a question just popped up. In the request log, can I see both the source IP and the exported for? I often don't know the real IP because the proxy or load balancer hides it. Now that's something we covered, I believe, in the very first session. Let me just take a quick detour about that. No, you won't see both logged in the request log. FusionReactor handles that by going to requests, settings, excuse me, and then proxy. Not obvious, I realize, but that's where it is. And so here you go. His point is, excuse me, he's got a load balancer. Let me get some water. Don't like clearing my throat in your ear. He's got a load balancer or a caching server or whatever that is not presenting to his application server, whether it's Cold Fusion, Lucid, Java, doesn't matter. It's not presenting the real IP address to people. It presents the load balancers or the proxies or the caches, but it passes along a header called exforwarded for. That's the real IP address. Well, that's tracked in Fusion, or can be tracked in FusionReactor by telling this request, settings, proxy, exforwarded for, and save. And now instead, in all the interface and in all the logs, instead of it being what the original IP address was, it's going to be whatever was in the exforwarded for. Okay. And by the way, some of you may say, well, that's cool that I could pick these two, but mine is called Bob, whatever yours is called. Well, the good news is it's not clear from this interface, but if my header that had the IP address was Bob, I could just type Bob and hit save. You can do that. So you can either pick the ones that are here or type whatever your header is. It doesn't matter. All right. So anyway, that's a interesting diversion, was worth covering because if you're going to leverage these logs, you're going to probably want to know the real IP address. So there you go. All right, and there's so many logs here. I don't want to go into it in this presentation. We've covered these in other webinars. We've talked about the logs in other webinars. What's new is the archive viewer, and I just wanted people who hadn't seen that to know that it's here. It's really very powerful. And there's more I could say, but we're going to move on because this is not a presentation all about that alone. Okay, I've covered all those points. All right. Now moving on, the logs are great and the archive viewer is great, but some people are going to say, I don't want to dig around through logs. I don't care if you give me a nice friendly interface. I still don't want to dig around through logs, and I get that. And part of that is that the look into the logs is after you know there's a problem, and maybe it's even after the instance has crashed. But wouldn't it have been helpful to have been given some information prior to the crash that there was a problem pending? And so this is a slight variation. It is going to be about post-crash troubleshooting, but my point is if you think to enable this FusionReactor feature called alerts, crash protection alerts, you would get, prior to the crash, some notification that a problem was happening. And more importantly, let's say you were in a meeting or you were over sleeping or you were out that day and you want to come back and figure out what the heck was going on prior to the crash. Well, you could also leverage these alerts to say, well, what was going on prior to the crash? Now, let me talk about the alerts for a second, because some people hear this and they go, look, I don't need any more alerts. Trust me. I've got watch mouse and I've got, site 24/7. I got plenty of things watching my server telling me when it's unresponsive. I don't need more emails. Wait, time out. That's not what we're talking about here. This is not an alert like all those other alerts, because those are looking from the outside saying, can they not reach your server? Can they not reach your application? Is it not responding in a certain number of seconds? There's value to those. I'm not disagreeing. There's value to those. What I'm saying is those are only going to occur after the problem's so bad that they get that situation of slow response. What if FusionReactor, watching things from the inside the way it does, could tell you the gas is building up in the cave and you need to get out, the canary in the coal mine, if you understand the analogy. So yeah, FusionReactor's got these alerts which can be triggered when conditions are arising. And one point is you'll get these alerts before you get those other alerts. So it'll tell you the problems bubbling to the surface before it perhaps becomes so bad that nobody can get in. That's one value. But even that may not impress anybody because they've found that they get the alert and then it's full and it's crashing. That didn't help me. Okay, I get it. But the other value of the alerts is that they have much more information in them than any external monitoring alert can have. All they can tell you is, I tried to call this URL and it didn't respond. And they can graph it and they can track it over time, and that's good. But they can't tell you what was going on inside of your instance at that time. They can't tell you what was the CPU, what was the memory the heap used. They can't tell you what requests were running. They can't tell you what queries were running. Well, guess what? FusionReactor's crash protection alerts can tell you that. That's the value of these. I just want to make this point because many people kind of yawn at the thought of another alert. No. This is not your grandfather's alerts. These alerts give you so much information. And the point here for this webinar is with that information, even if you get the alerts after it's crashed or you go looking at them post-mortem, you will see in them levels of detail that may tell you what was the problem. Now, they may be the right thing to look at first, but sometimes the archive viewer would really be the best thing. First thing I'd do is open up the archive viewer and look at the thing prior to the crash and say, okay, does that tell me anything? Because sometimes it'll just jump right out. But yeah, the alerts can also give you more insight. So there's three kinds of alerts in the FusionReactor interface. Let me show you. So we're talking about down here on the bottom left under protection. Now, different people, you'll see different buttons. I happen to have the Ultimate Edition, so I've got Debug and Memory and Profiler, so you won't see those if you're on Standard or Enterprise. And System Resources is an Ultimate as well. But everybody else would see JDBC and Protection and so on. So Protection, now it's classic for people to go to the first thing on the list, but that's not what you want to do here. You want to go to Protection Settings. Protection Settings. Now, I'll say again, I covered these in more detail in a previous webinar. I don't want to go into them in detail, but I just want you guys to understand from a post-crash troubleshooting perspective, if you enable these alerts, they could be valuable. And the way you do them just real quickly is, like, I would recommend only this one. There's one that says, tell me when requests are taking more than X seconds. I don't like that because you might get a lot of those, even if it's just a minor problem. There's one that says, tell me when the heap is above a certain amount. I don't like that one because the heap could be above 80% and still not be a problem. I get it. You think it's important. I'm just telling you my experience is that it's not. This is what's important, the quantity protection. In my experience, I'm not saying this is always true, but 90% of the time when I help people, if we'd set up a quantity protection alert, we would be saying, hey, look, I want to know when X requests have been running constantly over a period of Y seconds, not over a duration of Y seconds, but over a period of Y seconds, I've had X or more requests running. So again, I've covered this in more detail. I'm not going to go back into detail now, but let's just say for most people, in my experience, well, let me just say quickly, if you look at your metrics, web metrics, because some people are going to misunderstand what I'm getting at. If you look at your metrics, web metrics, now my server is very lightly loaded, I get that. But in here, there's two numbers. One is the dark green, which is requests per second, basically when it says completed, it's requests per second. And the light green is requests running. Now, I'm going to go to the demo server. I've mentioned this in previous webinars. There's demo.fusion-reactor.com, demo.fusion-reactor.com. And this one here too, it's not very busy, but you can see there's more traffic. And this is getting on average about 2 or 3 requests per second. But the light green, you can barely see it. There's only a couple times when there's any running request. Like right there, there's one active. Right there, there's one active. So the light green, and by the way, you can take away the anything, and now you're left with the what remains. So here's my running request. My point is that if for most of you, if you look right now at your production server, you will not find there's many running requests. I know you think your server's busy. That's completed requests. That's requests per second. But you might find, like I have, and I see often, that it's very rare that you have many running requests. Meaning at the moment this graph said, and the log said how many are running, there weren't many running. I know it's busy, could be 20 requests per second, 100 requests per second, and you might still find that there's rarely more than a few requests running. And when they're taking longer, then they tend to be more, because then they maybe have something causing them to be longer. We covered that in previous webinars. But I'm just saying, if you look at this, and let's say you look at your current minute or go to the hour view, that's really great. We covered that in the first session. If you go to the hour view, I can now say that no, over my last hour, I have not had more than a few requests running. And that was on the demo server, and here's on my careheart.org server. And then no, these are both very lightly loaded, but just I'm saying, you look at yours. You look at your current hour when all's well, and if you see that no, you never got above, just pick a number, 10, 15, 20, that's running requests, not requests per second. And let's say you never got above 10 running requests. Well, then I'm arguing that if you ever got to 10, that would be worrisome. If you got to 20, that would be, hey, time to tell an alert. That's probably a sign that things are getting bad. All right. So that's why I'm saying you would want to set up the request quantity protection. I'll just say in most people's cases, I say make it like 20 and 20. I made it 21 for some reason, but the point is 20 and 20. So if, first of all, if there are more than 20, I want to be notified. And then second, not just when there's 20, any random moment, but if over a period of 20 seconds, I constantly have in those 5-second checks. So within 4 checks every 5 seconds, do I have 20 running? The 4 times I checked during a 20-second interval. And if the answer is yes, there were 20 running each of those checks over that 20 seconds. Sorry if that confused anybody, but the point is that's when it's going to alert you. Now, what do you want to do? And I just want to get an email alert. Now, I know there's features in here to start queuing requests and rejecting requests, and for other ones to start killing requests. I'm not a fan of that. I know some people like that. That's the protection part. I would argue, look, if you just get the information, you can find and fix the problem and not potentially have these queuing and aborting things causing more trouble or confusing matters. So just take my word for it. For most people, just do the email. Just get yourself the email, and then you come down here and save it, and then you go to the settings page, which is really just this email settings, and you enable them. I must have something going on my server to make it slow to respond, or it could be a networking issue. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to go over here. Oh, nope, you can't do that. It's a read-only view. But anyway, so here I am in email settings, and I would want to enable it. By default, it's disabled. You just want to enable it. And there's some other things here I'll leave you to read about that. I wouldn't change anything except maybe showing the user agent. And I covered why in the other webinar. And then finally, at the bottom of this page, after you've saved that, sorry, at the top, oh, they used to have a page here that said, oh, it's maybe not there. You need to configure who's going to get the email. Where's it going to come from? What mail server is it going to go through? And if you hadn't configured that, there'd be a box telling you need to do that. So then again, that box would point you up here to FusionReactor settings. So the FusionReactor settings page is where you say, who do they come from? Who do they go to? Through what mail server? And everything else. And then you would test it, make sure you get the test email, and then save it. Again, I covered this more in another webinar. The point is, you would want these alerts to be enabled so that if ever a problem happened, you'd get one. Let's look at one real quick. I've got one ready here. So here's an example of a FusionReactor crash protection alert. And it tells you, where it came from and what kind it was. You want to pay attention to that and when it happened. And then check out some of the stuff you get from this. This is why I'm saying they're much more than just the kind of alerts you're maybe used to getting. This tells me what kind it was, how many requests were running. Here was my threshold, when they were triggered at, when it'll next trigger. This is the alerts. Then look at this, how many requests were running and how long were they taking on average? What was the heap? Whoa, look at that, 95, oh, but that's only 95 out of 900, so it's only 10%. So just be careful, you want to look at the percentage. But my CPU, so this is CF's use of CPU, and this is the total box CPU. So, whoa, I had a problem where my CPU is very high. I'd want to understand what that was about. And there was virtually no queries running. So just right there, you see, right there, I could go, well, it's definitely not a database problem. And requests are taking a long time, but my CPU is very high. I got to understand why the CPU is high. Now, somebody might say, well, that's what I need to know. Well, we have had prior webinars where we covered dealing with high CPU. So again, I don't want to elaborate solving this particular problem. I just want to say that sometimes you can tell right away, just from this level of detail, things that you would not have known from any other learning mechanism. But wait, there's more. So then, this is the triggering request. That's the one that made the problem happen. Made you go over the level of 20. But that's usually just started. Yours might only be milliseconds old. The running request, check this out. You can see all the requests that are running, and you see when they started and what their IP address is, and what their thread ID is, and what their CF request ID is, and what URL was running, and what query string, and what user agent, and how long they took. And isn't that all great stuff? Now, something else I'll tell you is that if you ever get an alert and you look in here and all the ID numbers, which is FusionReactor's giving an ID to every request, well, some of you already know what's going on here. This server had just restarted. It had, the CF, in my case CF, or the box had just restarted. FusionReactor had just restarted. And as you know, the first requests coming in often are slow to run. And so I would tend to dismiss this alert because I go, oh, okay, this was just the instance restarting. Now, maybe that's news to you. You might go, whoa, I didn't know the instance restarted. Well, that would be a clue, right? That would be something you'd get from the alert. So again, I realize that you may not connect that dot. But let's just say the bigger point is that's not the issue. Again, you'd want to look at what the URLs were. Maybe there's significance to that. What are the query strings? What are the IP addresses? And then finally, if none of these told you what the problem was, you might go, well, I need to know why this guy was running for 30 seconds. And we've covered this in other webinars. I'm just going to say this really quickly. If I highlight that thread ID and copy it to the clipboard and do a find, I'm in Outlook, whatever you're using to look at them. If you're looking at it in Gmail, be sure to expand this to be the whole email. You don't want to be looking at Gmail's snipped view of the email. If you've got the full email open and you do a find, you're going to find usually only one other place in this entire email. Look at the size of the scroll bar. There's only going to be one other place in this entire email that refers to that particular thread ID. There. Now, again, and I've covered this in other webinars. This is not the point in this webinar to get into this detail, but this is telling me what that request was doing at that moment. And I can see it was waiting, in this case, on a pretty obscure problem of an abstract cache lock with soft caching, template caching. Again, remember, CF had just restarted in my case, so this is not a typical problem. Let's not worry about that. But in other webinars and other videos on YouTube, I cover this in more detail about how to read these alerts to understand what's going on. And then you would go find out if other requests in this alert had that same problem. And if they all had that, or many of them had that same problem, you go, oh, okay, well, that's the problem. So again, there's much more. We don't have time in this presentation to get into really digging into those. Other webinars have done that in more detail. So again, the real value to me is the request quantity alert to get that incredible detail of what was going on at the time requests started piling up. Finally, in our remaining 10 minutes, I want to mention that there's alerts on steroids. That's the way to put it. So we saw that in the FusionReactor alerts, we could alert on request quantity, slow requests exceeding a certain duration, or the heap being above a certain percentage. Those are the only 3 alerts that are available in the on-premise version, and these have been around forever. Well, FusionReactor Cloud is this separate service and feature you can add to your FusionReactor. It is literally added to it, and it's basically your local on-premise version would push data up to the cloud. The Integral company that supports makes FusionReactor, Integral runs it for you. You don't know anything about it. You just are given a URL. And in that cloud interface, you can look at this data in many different ways. And what I'm talking about for this presentation is you can set up alerts for them that are much more interesting. Now, I happen to have the cloud version, and if you do too, when you're looking at your FusionReactor interface, you're going to see a button up here. That cloud icon is telling you you can go look at your cloud interface. And I know some of you have never seen the cloud before. There was a separate webinar on this about a year ago, maybe 2. But go look at the webinars page at the end. I'll point you to that. There was a whole webinar on the cloud. It's probably time to do another one because the cloud's features evolved over time and there's new interface changes. But anyway, the slowness again must be on my end. I wouldn't attribute it to FusionReactor at all. So here is the cloud interface in a moment, going to log me in, or let me log in. So again, if you look at the URL, I'm not looking at my local machine anymore. I'm looking at app.fusionreactor.io. And I know it doesn't show my particular server, but I'm logged in only to me and my stuff. Nobody can see it but me. So welcome back me, and I'm seeing my servers. And again, I don't have time in this session to go over all of what the cloud can do, but I could see what what servers I have implemented, and I could drill into one of them, or I can look at things from an application perspective, and I could look at so much more detail. Again, this is not the webinar to get into what are all these tabs and how can I look back over time. It's a powerful bunch of stuff. I'll leave you all to look into that more, and you can read more about it on the website. But you notice up here, there's an alerting button. And by the way, that metrics is new. I'll leave you to explore that, the metrics viewer. But the alerting is what we want to talk about today. The point is, if you have the cloud version, in addition to all those other cool benefits that the cloud offers, one of them that a lot of people miss is that it's got its own alerting. Now, there's three kinds of things here: alerts, checks, and subscriptions. Let me just say quickly, alerts are ones that have happened. Checks are what kinds do we want to look out for. And then subscriptions are how do we want to notify people. Now, let me say quickly before I move on, if it's a subscription, I've just got it set up to send me email during these times, on these days, and I could edit and see, who that was, and I could test it. But look, if I click on plus subscription, I can create a new subscription. First, you can again control when do the alerts fire. You don't maybe want to get them on the weekend, maybe, or maybe you don't want to get them in the middle of the day, or you don't want them overnight, whatever. But then here's where things get really cool. The service, not only can it send email, but it can do any of these things. Now, these are unconfigured things currently. FlowDoc, a webhook, OpsGenie, PagerDuty. I could have those things be notified. And actually pretty sure there's more. I'll leave it to anybody either already using it or from Integral to chime in, because I thought there were more. Maybe have to configure something to see more. But the point is, even these are much more than just email. And so you could have them be where the alerts are sent. Okay, so that's what the subscription is where the alerts are sent. And then as far as what kind of checks do I have, that's this. And to add new checks, I click the plus check. And it says, do I want to do a status check or a threshold check? And then I give it a name and a description. And then do I want to look at a particular instance or a group or an application? Again, these are things that have to do with understanding how the cloud works. But let's just say I wanted to look at a particular instance. I would pick an instance. In my case, my CF 2018 instance. And then look at this. This is where it gets exciting. Look at what I can check on. All kinds of stuff. Buffer pools, if you care about that. Class loading, CPU in the instance or in the system. Garbage collection, right? You want to get an alert when garbage collection is excessive? You can get it now. You want to get it when the time spent in garbage collection is excessive? You can get it. You want to get it when queries are taking a long time or happening too often, or how about this, not happening at all? How about that? What if you usually get 100 queries per second, and you'd like to be told if ever there's suddenly 0 queries per second? That would be just as important as too many. Well, yeah, you can do that. I'm just going to pick that as a random example, because you can say for that condition, for that metric, as it were, trigger when the points are even less than a certain number. So like if I'll say, if they're less than 10 per second, that's what that would be saying. So I'll get an error if they're less than 10, maybe I'll get a warning if they're less than 20. I'll leave you to dig into that. And do you look at it over the last 5 minutes? Again, this is pretty elaborate, and it can be a little bit, there's cooldown periods, it's really cool stuff. But having selected that, then I say what subscription should be notified about that. So I'll leave you to dig into that. And this is just a graph that shows what those numbers have been like recently. So to give you a sense of whether you'd be getting that alert already. And in case, I picked on a very lightly loaded server, it's not doing a lot of queries, got a lot of caching going on, but you might see you do 100 queries per second, or 200, or 1,000. I've seen it. And so then if it was 10, you'd be seeing that this would be a very small number below your typical number. The point is you can preview it. And once you've saved it, now that check is in place, and we'll send alerts to those notifications. And here's examples in my case of when those have happened. And I had one that said, check for garbage collections. When I do more than 2 garbage collections per second of major GCs, I want to be notified. That's in place and it's running, and I can also look at that particular one and see when it's happened. So here are times, so just even today, I had such an indication of that circumstance. So again, I'll leave you to look into that. We're at the top of the hour. It's just amazing how much cool stuff is in there. And I didn't even go over all the checks. I stopped at having looked at only about 5. There's about 50 things you could set up the alerts to check on. So really the cloud alerting feature is very cool. Has a lot more things and a lot more ways to be notified than the old school alerts. But again, that even if you don't have that, 90% of what I've shown you today has been the stuff prior to this. You don't need anything special. Any version of FusionReactor could do any of these. The only thing is that the archive metrics, you do need to be on 7.2 or above. Oh, and one other thing I did want to say about the cloud alerts is that we talked in the last session about the profile feature. So if you're on Ultimate, there's a profile feature, and the profiles are great when you're in the interface, and that's what I showed last time. But another benefit of the cloud is that it can store profiles over time, even over restarts. So I could have, in the interface, looked at a profile prior to a restart. And that's cool, because if you know what the profiles are about, if you followed that, or if you've used it, you've noticed that they go away when you restart. Well, with the cloud, they can be configured to be saved into the cloud, and then you could look at them after a restart. So again, I'm just saying that's all these things are really compelling ways to deal with post-crash troubleshooting. So we've seen the logs, they track nearly everything that FusionReactor tracks. We've seen the archive metrics to look at them as either graphs or spreadsheet or to export them. We saw the alerts and how they have great detail about what went on prior to a crash. It can be really valuable to look at after the fact. And then we saw these alerts, and they offer so much more than the on-prem version does. So remember, this was the last part of the series. You want to go back and watch these others if you missed them. What's just happened on my server 6 weeks ago? Why are requests running slowly 4 weeks ago? Why are they slow for less obvious reasons 2 weeks ago? And then today. And all these and others, about 15 other webinars that have been done covering various aspects of what we discussed in more detail, are available at fusion-reactor.com/webinars. And I'll say again that these 4 parts have not covered all that FusionReactor can do. We just tried to highlight in these 4 parts the key things to focus on when you're trying to do troubleshooting. And we've seen that at various points we've said there's more to dig into, more to understand, more you can do. And so there is definitely much more to FusionReactor. But I hope, having watched these 4, you do feel more confident that you could do troubleshooting in ways that you never would have been able to do otherwise. Even various existing JVM tools can't do things that FusionReactor can do. I hope you can appreciate that now. And so I'll just say in final that you can learn more about FusionReactor, including getting a free 14-day free trial and downloading it and getting updates. If you're on an old version, you can get an upgraded version. If you're under maintenance, it's free. If it's just a minor point release, that's free. So anyway, I'll leave you to dig into that. There's docs and videos and tech notes and forums and so much more. So don't ever feel like you're at a loss to understand FusionReactor. There's ample resources out there. And if you get stuck and need help to know how to find something or some particular question, you can email sales or support to ask such questions, and they'll guide you as appropriate. There's also a phone number to call for sales. And by the way, both the email address and the phone number are offered on the front page of the website. So you don't have to remember this. Just go to the FusionReactor website. They're in the top right corner of the interface. And then if you need consulting assistance, there's a sister site to FusionReactor.com called cfconsultant.com, and you can hire consulting help through them. Often it'll be me that they will pass work to. So anyway, you can also reach me directly, carehart.org. So we welcome your feedback on these and other webinars. Anything else you'd like to see, we'd love to hear it. Thanks for the kind comments coming in. I appreciate that. And I do want to open the floor now for questions, but I'll put this back on the screen for people to look at while I'm answering any. What tools do you recommend? Yeah, so someone said, what tools do you recommend to examine exported FusionReactor logs? So I mentioned this in passing. Excel or OpenOffice Calc are great because they're just log files. Now, we covered this in an entire webinar, so just go to that FusionReactor webinars page and just look for log, and you'll find I did a couple webinars on understanding the FusionReactor logs and then importing them into Excel, and then even more enhanced features. I was showing pivot tables and other cool stuff. So Excel is an excellent, and when I say Excel or OpenOffice Calc or Google Spreadsheets or whatever you prefer to use, Dropbox or whatever spreadsheet mechanisms you have, you can do analysis of the logs that way. And I covered in that presentation that they're basically just space separated. Space delimited, yeah. So they're comma separated, space delimited, and most tools have a way for you to tell how are they delimited. Thank you again for the kind comments, people popping in. Yeah, definitely get up to 7.2. Pricing of FusionReactor, that's on the FusionReactor website. In fact, let me just show that real quick because I think a lot of people don't appreciate the richness of what's on the FusionReactor website. So fusion-reactor.com. So this is the FusionReactor website. Now, when you first go there, there'll be a big banner up here telling you you got to accept cookies because they're in Germany and the GDPR requires that. So you just click the X to make it go away after you agree to it, of course. But anyway, so once you're on this page, each of these menus goes into greater depth about things. So you can see the kind of things FusionReactor can monitor. There's a page on pricing, upgrading, lots of support resources. There's a blog. There's about us. But the features in particular, look, here's looking at the features at a higher level, lower level, looking at the editions. There's a developer edition. There's a nice feature panel where you can click on things and drill into them. And then you can compare the different editions. I didn't mean to click that. Right, it went to the feature panel. As long as we're here, I'll let that populate and show you that you can drill in graphically into whatever things grab your attention or drill in this other way. But I was trying to say that in the features page, you can compare the on-prem editions, so standard, enterprise, ultimate. You can see what the cloud is about, and there's different cloud editions, enterprise and ultimate. So I'll leave you to look into that. All right. And I think that's it for the questions. So I think I've answered most of them online for you. Awesome. Thanks everybody for the kind comments. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. So we're at about an hour. And we'll look forward to doing more webinars in the future, lots more things to cover. Like I said, the new FusionReactor 8 features, more on the archive viewer perhaps for some people, more on some other aspects of using it. So look for those and let us know via those email addresses, whatever else you might like to see. We'd love to do more webinars to help encourage you. And until the next time.